make you fishers of men. And because of the call and because of the preparation, they left it all. They dropped those nets and they said, I'm coming hard after God. I got a question for you today. Are you willing and are you ready to let the voice of God speak to you in such a way that you will follow what he wants you to do? Will you believe God? Would you get invested in the things that God's heart is invested in? Would you love? Would you pray? Would you submit yourself? Would you dare to go on a challenging, go on a journey? Would you let the Lord rip your life wide open and do something amazing? Because you don't just live for your own agenda, but you truly lay down self and you start following after God. God still calls people today. He's calling people out of mundane lives. He's calling people out of meaningless areas of toil. He doesn't want you just burning out. He doesn't want you just living halfway lives. He wants you to have a purpose as to who you are and a reason to get up in the morning and be who he's made you to be. He's still calling people today. Some of you might be having a real challenge in your heart right now. In fact, your stomach might be just turning in knots, and it's not because it's almost lunchtime. It's because God is speaking to you. Why can I say that? Because I've been there myself. Many of you know my story. Those of you who've been here for years, you know my story up one side and down the other. But many others of you don't know anything about me or my story, so I'm going to take a moment of your time. I grew up in a commercial fishing family. My dad was a fisherman, and from the time I was 10 years old, he took me to sea with him. And as I grew older, I went to Alaska. I fished in Alaska and spent years fishing in Alaska. And as I got to be about 19 years old, there was a time out in the midst of a very rough sea that we were catching nothing. We'd been working 20 hours a day. The boat never stopped. As a crew member, we would get 4 hours of sleep. And it was miserable. We were fishing 20 miles of gear every day, bad weather, cold, miserable. And yet in the midst of that, because we weren't catching anything, my dad decided we were going to haul up all of our gear and we're going to travel for 24 hours and try a different spot. And you have a certain amount of days you could fish, and the clock was going, and so it was closing in on us. The only advantage of this, it was very rough seas. It was very rough. But the one advantage was that it only took one guy to be on wheel watch, and the rest of us could go get some sleep. And so I jumped in my bunk like all the other guys jumped in theirs, and we would pack ourselves in with life jackets so that we wouldn't get pitched out in the midst of the seas. And I went to sleep on this stormy night in Alaska. And in the middle of that time of sleep, God gave me a dream. And I'm not a guy that puts a lot of credence in dreams. In fact, probably this is the only one in my entire life that had meaning to me. But in this dream, I knew it was more than just getting pitched around in the middle of the night. And in this dream, I saw myself preaching. And you got to realize something. I never aspired or wanted to ever be a preacher. It was the last thing on my agenda. But in this dream, I saw myself, and I didn't know why, but somehow I knew that it was on the West Coast. I couldn't tell you if it was just a really large high school or if it was like a small college, but it was a football stadium. And in that football stadium, there was people in the stands, and there was like a track, and then there was the green field. And I was on a platform in the green field preaching to the people that were in the stands. And it was such a profound moment that I knew there was meaning to it. And God spoke to me and said, I'm calling you from this position of fishing to go and prepare your heart to be a minister, to be an evangelist, to speak the word and call people to Christ. And I knew it. It was irrefutable. It was undeniable. But I had this little negotiation with God. Have you ever done that? I was like, oh, God, if you want me to go do this and prepare myself, well, that's going to take a lot of money, and I'm sure not making any money on this trip. And it was like he said, don't worry about it. The next couple of days, you're going to see something powerful. So about 4 in the morning, the boat slowed down. We got to the spot where we were going to drop gear. We all had a quick breakfast together, and then we charged out to go work the rest of this little bit of time we had to fish. The next day, we started catching halibut like nothing any of us had ever seen. In fact, we were catching so many fish, we couldn't even dress them and keep up with them. There were some of them that literally jumped back overboard because we had fish all the way up to the side, the rails, and when the boat would move at all, fish were jumping back into the water. I got a picture of me jumping on top of a halibut, and I've got a gannion in his mouth, and you see his head coming up like this, and then the back of the picture is his tail coming out behind my head. And I was like a jockey trying to keep this fish on board. And in those last few days, we caught so many fish, we made up our expenses, and I made thousands of dollars for being on that trip. And so I went home knowing that God had spoken to me. And I did what any other young guy in that position would do. I bought a new car, and I bought a motorcycle, and I just started distancing myself from that moment as if it never happened. And I was just pushing myself away from that. And then time would go on, and I would go to church. Why do I tell you that your stomach might turn in knots? Because God's doing something for you? Because I sat just where you're at today. And my pastor would preach, and it didn't matter what he was preaching on. He could preach on marriage. He could preach on the color of the sky. I mean, it did not matter. And I would be there, and my stomach would be just twisted in knots because the Lord would be saying to me, what are you doing here? You're out of the will of God. You're missing what I am about to do in your life. You are just so narrow-minded. You are so selfish that you think you know what's going to make you happy more than I do. And in the midst of it, you're cutting yourself off from the blessing of God. What are you doing here? You are out of the will of God. So some other Sunday, I would sit in a different place, and it didn't matter where I sat. The stomach would just still turn in knots, and God would say the same thing. You're out of the will of God.